36, Nashville's Morning News on Super Talk 99.7 WTN. Welcome on in to Nashville's Morning News. Hans von Spakovsky is joining us, legal analyst, best-selling author, and all-around good guy. Hans, how are you?
I'm doing just fine, thanks.
There's a lot of stuff going on at the Supreme Court, and I need somebody a lot smarter than me to figure all this stuff out. So one of the things that I'm really interested in hearing your opinion on is Donald Trump's tariffs. They're in the news. We've had companies suing the administration of the president's use of emergency powers to implement those tariffs. Now, the president has come out and said, and Scott Bessent has come out and said, well, we have a backup plan. But what do you think the chances are that the court is going to overrule the president and his use of? Remind me what it was that the president said he was. What justification did he use for the tariffs?
Well, there were two.
Okay.
I mean, he's using this 1973 law that gives the power to the president to suspend and otherwise regulate the importation of goods from particular countries under national security and economic emergency.
Yeah, emergency powers.
Right. And that law has never been interpreted by the courts. So the Supreme Court's never ruled on it. And remember, he imposed two kinds of tariffs. He imposed basically trade tariffs on countries that were putting up trade barriers to us. But then he also imposed tariffs on countries like Mexico and Canada because he said they weren't doing enough to stop the smuggling of fentanyl into the United States. And look, I don't know how the Supreme Court's going to come out because, like I said, this law has never been interpreted by the court. Does he have, are the things that he says are emergencies, are they really emergencies? He said that the trade deficit that the U.S. has is so large that it's hurting us economically, and that is, he says, an emergency. The folks arguing against this have said, well, that trade deficit's been that large for a long time, and so it's not some sudden emergency you can use. And how are they going to rule? Like I said, I really don't think anybody can predict what the court's going to do about it.
The president says, Hans, that he's got some backup plans, some grand backup plans to basically accomplish the same thing. So if the court comes out and rules against him, then he is saying that he can accomplish the same thing via a different path. I mean, how confident are you in that?
I'm not sure what he's talking about.
Okay.
There, quite frankly. I mean, he was using this particular authority of this this emergency statute that Congress passed in the, like I said, 1970s. I don't know what other authority he thinks he's got to do it, and they haven't. You'll notice they haven't said.
Yeah.
You know, they haven't said. They just say, well, we have a backup plan, but they haven't given us the details. Now, look, Friday of last week was the first day, really, the Supreme Court was back after the vacation. All these people were expecting they would come out with a decision on the tariff case because there's so much money at stake.
Oh, yeah.
But it didn't happen.
What do you think that means? Does that mean that maybe this is a little bit more complicated, or maybe a lot of more complicated issue, and they just need a lot more time to discuss?
Yeah, I think that is what it is. Okay. Plus, look, this week actually kicks off really the 26th session of the court, and tomorrow they're hearing two related cases, probably two of the most important cases they've got involving the laws of 24 states that banned biological males from competing in women's sports.
Yeah.
And they're hearing arguments in those cases on an Idaho law and a West Virginia law that the courts of appeal enjoined and said, oh, you can't do that. That's discriminatory. So those are the two of the biggest cases they've got, and those are being argued tomorrow.
Hans, one of the, I thought this was interesting. So I saw a story about how more than 200 female lawmakers have signed on to this amicus brief backing the legal defense to save women's sports. Not surprisingly, all of the signees are Republicans and all the liberals. I mean, they're backing, they want men to play in women's sports. But this amicus brief, does it really mean anything other than them supporting women's sports?
Yeah. Look, there have been multiple amicus briefs filed in this case. And, you know, what is an amicus brief? It's a friend of the court brief. It's something that's not filed by the parties, but people who say, well, we have an interest in this case. And, you know, the Supreme Court, they read them, but some they pay attention to and some they don't. I actually think they'll pay attention to this particular one. And like I said, this is such an important issue because it's going to affect particularly girls in high school who are competing to try to get scholarships to go to college. And if boys who claim they're female suddenly start competing, they're not going to be able to win many of those scholarships. Plus there's the chance of injury also, because we've already seen injuries caused, again, by boys claiming they're girls competing in these sports. Hans von
Spakovsky is joining us. Knowing the makeup of the court, and just real quick, but knowing the makeup of the court with the men playing on women's sports team, I can't imagine a world where Amy Coney Barrett actually sides with the liberals on this one, but she's surprised me before.
No, I actually think, I suspect this is going to be a 6-3 decision upholding these state laws, and I would cite to you the case out of Tennessee that they decided last year, the Scarametti case. Remember, that was the case in which Tennessee, again, along with a lot of other states, banned transsexual surgeries and drug treatments for minors, and the court upheld that.
Gerrymandering in the news, of course, leading into the midterm elections. Supreme Court, right now, they're looking at Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Critics are saying that this was designed to prevent the voting power of Black Americans to be diluted by gerrymandering state districts. So this is a really big deal for the midterm elections. Some are saying this is the most important decision the Supreme Court could make because of the fact that it impacts the midterm elections. So where do you think this is going to go?
I'm hoping that they do what they should have done years ago, which was to quit allowing. Look, Section 2 is an important law. It was passed to stop not vote dilution, but to stop straight out racial discrimination. You know, the laws in places like Alabama and Georgia, they're keeping blacks from registering and from voting. The whole way it's been used for redistricting, particularly in the last 20 years, it hasn't been used to stop racial discrimination. It's been used, frankly, by the Democratic Party for political purposes. And what's happened often in many of these cases is when legislatures, Republican legislatures, draft up plans to favor Republicans, courts misinterpret the law to say, oh, you're engaging in racial discrimination. They confuse political motivations with racial motivations. And what I'm hoping happens is Supreme Court's going to come out and put in much stricter standards for finding a violation of Section 2. In other words, you have to prove real racial discrimination, not just that you're going to be put to political disadvantage.
So, I mean, you've been watching this as I have. Do you have an idea as to where this one might go? Because, you know, the power in Washington, D.C. could be impacted by this, obviously.
Yeah. No, I actually think they are going to come out and rule that we're putting in much stricter standards, like I said, for determining whether there's actual racial discrimination going on, as opposed to simply people trying to give an advantage to their political party.
7:45, and Hans, got a couple more questions for you. Busy day, though, in traffic. Got to check the roads real quick on WTN.
Gallatin, 31 East, southbound of Brights Lane. We've got an accident involving a tractor trailer. Emergency crews on the scene. Hendersonville, Vietnam Veterans Boulevard, westbound, a crash before Indian Lake Boulevard. Antioch, Murfreesboro Pike. We've got an accident near Mount View Road. I'm Christy O'Brien.
As far as weather goes, today's sunny, a high around 50. Prepare for the possibility of snow later this week. All right, Hans, ripped from the headlines this morning, a federal judge, Biden appointee, has ruled that President Trump cannot pull child care funding from these 5 Democrat-run states, including Minnesota and California, until it's proven that it is not fraudulent, that these states are not fraudulent. This is only temporary, but talk about the issues of waste, fraud, and abuse, and why the president may or may not be able to keep our taxpayer dollars safe from fraudsters in blue states, because Trump is like, we're not giving you this money until you can prove to us that you're not committing fraud.
Yeah, this particular judge, it's a guy named Aaron Submaranian. Look, he's not only a Biden appointee, he was a clerk at the U.S. Supreme Court for who? Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the most liberal member of the court in the last half century. And I want folks to just think about this. He's a judge in the Southern District of New York, right? He only has jurisdiction in a very limited area, and yet he issues an order affecting California, Minnesota, Illinois, Colorado, in addition to New York. That tells you he's not looking at the actual law. This is pure politics. And I actually think his decision was wrong to enjoin this. The plaintiffs ought to have to prove that they don't have the same kind of massive fraud going on, that they have basic regulations and inspections in place to prevent the kind of fraud we've seen in Minnesota before they're entitled to receive federal money. Why? Because once that federal money gets paid, you can't ever get it back.
No, and here's the thing. California, I mean, there's big talk the last couple of weeks about how corrupt or incompetent California is. Chicago is one of the most corrupt cities in the nation, of course, Illinois. So it does seem to make sense to say, you know what, we're going to pull this back until we can figure out if you guys are acting as good stewards of the taxpayer money.
Right. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Okay, one last story. We've all been talking about the ICE officers in Minneapolis, whether or not he will be charged, the one that shot and killed Renee Good. So what do you think? There's a new wrinkle, by the way, where the attorney who represented Derek Chauvin says that the state could go after the ICE officer even if there's no federal charges, especially with how this is being politicized. How much legal peril is that ICE officer in?
Well, that lawyer is not a very good lawyer, because in the late 1800s, in a case that went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, it's a very well-known case, the U.S. Supreme Court said, in essence, federal agents cannot be criminally prosecuted by local prosecutors when they are carrying out their federal duties. So this ICE agent was carrying out his federal duties, and the locals can't prosecute him. I'm sorry, but that's been the law for 150 years.
One of the things that everybody's talking about, last question here, Hans, and this is, I guess, maybe a legal question, but maybe just a question of, asking for your observations as somebody who is an expert in the Constitution and law. So we've been watching all of these crazed protests happening all across the country, similar to what we saw during George Floyd. And it's frustrating because we see these people clearly breaking the law, clearly impeding ICE, and clearly they are not worried about any legal ramifications or consequences to their behavior. What do we need to do as a country to increase the penalties for these folks that are attacking ICE officers, throwing rocks at, ICE officers or snowballs or whatever? But how do we make sure that there are consequences to this kind of behavior where it discourages this kinds of behavior in the future? Because this is not freedom of expression. Oftentimes this is assault.
Yeah, the real problem here are local prosecutors and local law enforcement that's not doing anything about it.
Yep.
So what that means is that the U.S. Justice Department, particularly the U.S. attorneys in these states, they need to gear up. They need to get the FBI there. And when ICE agents are being obstructed, attacked, the FBI, federal law enforcement, needs to be there arresting these protesters and federally prosecuting them because the locals aren't doing their job. That's what needs to happen.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Hans, always great to have you on, and we'll have you on again soon. Hans von Spakovsky at 7:51 on Nashville's Morning News on Super Talk 99.7 WTN. The Super Text line, very busy this morning. Thank you. 615-73